A $1.5 billion project which will hopefully bring power bill relief to households and businesses.
Hopefully, it will reduce costs. That's all they can guarantee for $1.5 billion. Fingers crossed, eyes closed. Oh, look, hopefully. I would have thought a rigorously put together business plan with, cost analysis and projection of future earnings would have been, provided more surety than just hopefully. Well, they're saying hopefully because it's not going to reduce any costs or prices. And when people call them out on that, they'll say, well, we did only say hopefully.
In South Australia, a typical residential bill would reduce by $66 per annum and around $132 for a small business customer.
Well, Steve here, he sort of contradicts the hopefully intro that they made in that he says it's going to be $66 savings per annum. And, that's a very specific number. So it sounds like he has done due diligence in his business plan. Then he says about $132 for small business. But all of those numbers mean nothing because this project is not about lowering electricity prices for South Australians or shoring up their electricity supply, as you're about to find out, because he's from Electranet, and I will show a bit about them.
Electranet is a specialist in electricity transmission, providing energy and infrastructure solutions across Australia. Our core business is to build, own,
I've just paused it here to highlight what they just said then. Own.
Operate, maintain and develop the electricity transmission highways that transport electricity over long distances. We own over $2.5 billion of electricity assets.
Own seems to be a big part of their core business because with ownership comes control. So if they own their infrastructure, well, who owns Electranet? So the owners of Electranet are these three organisations here. Now, presumably they're in order of how much they own. So the State Grid International Development, Asia and Australia Holding Company, the international arm of the State Grid Corporation of China. So they're obviously the biggest shareholder. Then you've got YTL Power Investments. They're an international company. And at the bottom, Australian Utilities. So let's just have a quick look at the executive team for State Grid International. Now, the State Grid of China is obviously subservient to the Communist Party, but these are their people within this company that run the show. Now, could you imagine, was any of this ever mentioned in any election promise in the lead up to any elections? Did anyone say, any of these politicians that were in charge at the time they sold this stuff, go, okay, one of our policies is to sell ownership and control over to Chinese, and we'd just like to bring these people out at the press conference. Now, here's Mr. Hu You Are, and Haxi Long, all these people, parade them there and go, and we'd just like to introduce the new team that's running and controlling your electricity. Now, because if they did that, everyone would tell them, go get staff. But that's what they've done. So these people here now make decisions. Now, they're going to make decisions in favour of China, of course, and I'll get to that.
This network moves electricity from traditional and renewable power generators in South Australia and interstate to where it is needed. As it integrates new technology and renewable generation into the economy, Electranet is the largest connector of wind generation in Australia.
Now we're getting down to the true purpose of the Chinese owning Electranet. It is to implement all of this renewable energy that is very expensive, unreliable, and most importantly, it affects our GDP in that it makes our companies less competitive, which of course China would want naturally. But China is being used by the international banks to, first of all, in trade deals to take the labour off, take manufacturing out of countries. But they're also using China for this purpose as well. So we'll go further into debt.
Final plans revealed for an electricity interconnector to join us with New South Wales. It'll run from Robertstown east of the Clare Valley to Wagga Wagga in the Riverina. Predicted savings to customers from the project bigger than initially forecast.
It would be very, very helpful and hopefully it happens.
It's a good thing for the consumer, isn't it?
So they just continue to lie that this story is about lowering prices for South Australian consumers, because do you really think these guys here back at the State Grid in China really care about this woman?
Premier says Project Interconnect will make our grid more reliable.
This will allow
baseload power to come into South Australia on days where we need it.
So here's the Premier lying about the true nature of what this actual interconnection is about. Sure, they may transfer a bit of electricity back from time to time from New South Wales into South Australia. That's not what it's about, and they do actually allude to it a bit later on in the story.
But importantly, it will create a highway of opportunity for us to export renewable energy.
So finally, they actually mention what this is actually all about right at the end, but this is the main focus. Interestingly, they ran this story on the Today Show in New South Wales, but they didn't mention this part. They just framed it as New South Wales helping out South Australia with their electricity needs, but that is not what this is about. So the reason why they've mentioned it here is because they're trying to get it over the line with South Australian voters. They're trying to say that it's a good thing we might end up supplying electricity for that'll benefit our state. But it's not about benefiting the state of South Australia or anyone else. This is about forcing upon, first of all, South Australians, because the government just says, well, you know, the Chinese want to bring in renewables. What could we do? And they want to impose that, expand that into New South Wales. So that's what this is actually all about.
The project isn't over the line quite yet, with the interconnector still needing relevant approvals, including from the National Energy Regulator.
Now, the National Energy Regulator is what the bankers had control of while Turnbull was there. So if Turnbull was still there, just to get a tick straight away. But the leadership of the Liberal Party, look, they're scammers, but I'll explain how they're not as bad as the international banks as far as the end result for us goes. Because for the international banks, it's armageddon. For us, it's all over. We lose everything. And part of that is shutting down the economy through this climate change policy and renewable energies that make us uncompetitive. So that's why Turnbull he's got his fingers in the next election as much as he can with Karen Phelps, with Julia Banks, with Zali Steggall. I'll get round to a video on that. He owns Bill Shorten, although they are going to push for Albanese. They got rid of Shorten just on some poll numbers and have Albanese in. But this is what this it's all tied in together. It's a big project by the banks, and they're still trying to get it across the line.
But it's hoped the first electricity will start flowing in 2022.
Note that he said 2022. Well, coincidentally, that's the year that AGL is going to close one of the biggest power stations in New South Wales. Where will we get our energy from? Wait a minute. There's an extension cord to a whole heap of renewables owned by China that we can now use. No, we'll be forced to use it. So as you can see, it's all planned a long time ago, back when all of the governments, all in unison, sold off, the state government sold off all their power and their utilities. It's all in preparation for this. And that's really what this project is all about. It's not about lower prices for anybody. It's about expanding the Chinese-owned and controlled electricity company Electranet, expanding into New South Wales to then impose green energy from, because as our power station's closed, that's where it's going to come from. And if you just have a look here, they've just built a new battery over on the on one of their peninsulas. That is supposedly the future of electricity, not just for South Australia, but also for New South Wales and probably the rest of Australia, which will make us uncompetitive. It's going to close down Tomago aluminium, and we're going to go further into debt, and then the bankers will own us all, and that's what this is all about.